This is Fox News Alert, a staple of global politics, stable really for so many decades. Henry Kissinger tonight, sad news, dead at the age of 100. Now, Secretary Kissinger worked under multiple administrations. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam. There's so many other accomplishments this man has had. His life background and his experience is really beyond inspiring. He was a Jewish refugee. He fled Nazi Germany with his family in 1938. He arrived in the United States. He excelled academically, graduated from Harvard, and earned an MA and PhD degrees at Harvard. Really somebody that so many look up to in so many different ways and accomplished so much. But really, became a household name. He served under two Republican presidents, one being Richard Nixon, the other being Gerald Ford. He advised powerful leaders in both the American political parties for decades. He was advising presidents up until recently. He came to be seen as perhaps one of the most prominent leading diplomats and international relations intellects of the 20th century. And orchestrated the normalization of relations with China during the Nixon presidency, helped ease tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at some of the tougher moments during the Cold War. He won that Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating that settlement that ended the Vietnam War. What a life that he has led, and was so instrumental in that the relations, opening diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China. Something up to that point not really doable or thinkable during the Nixon administration. One of the most, also he had his share of enemies and detractors for a lot of reasons, most of it having to do with Vietnam. Joining us now with reaction to the sad news tonight is Fox News contributor Ari Fleischer. Ari, I've had the pleasure of interviewing him. I've had the pleasure of having just general conversation with him. And it wasn't that long ago, the last conversation we had, and he was as sharp as he ever was. Amazing man, an amazing life. And again, our prayers are with his family tonight.
And, Sean, it was, for anybody who did get to know him, it really was a pleasure. He was such an intellect, such a force to listen to. His knowledge of history and his ability to sum up conclusions. I got to know him in November of 2002. If you remember this, probably very few people do, he was actually named to be the chairman of the 9/11 Commission. And then after he was named, Senator George Mitchell was going to be the Democrat co-chair of the 9/11 Commission. They both realized neither one of them wanted to do it. So Henry Kissinger, after he realized all the things he'd have to step down from, all the conflicts of interest, he spent a lot of time with me, talking to me about this, asking for my advice. Should he proceed with this? What's going to happen with all these other endeavors that he is in the middle of? And I told him the press will kill you. You can't have any other endeavors. The press will say it's a conflict of interest. And it really got to him because he wanted to serve. He didn't want the press controversy, and I was honored that he thought enough to ask for my advice and listen.
That was one thing about him. I remember very distinctly. It's interesting you say that. At a particular event, I had an opportunity to speak one-on-one with him, and he started asking me questions. I'm like, I should be asking you questions because of his, incredible background. When you think of, in light of what's going on in the world today, especially the rise of anti-Semitism, and he escaped Nazi Germany. I would have liked to have had that conversation with him because I didn't think we'd ever see this in our lifetime. I'm sure you think the same way, Ari.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. And I did get to talk to him about things of that nature because after the White House, when I moved back to New York, he and I would go to lunch sometimes. And sitting at a lunch table, just the two of us, I would ask him those kind of questions. I would ask him about his life. I'd ask him about coming to America, the opportunities of America, being Jewish. And it really was a fascinating conversation for me just to sit there and almost be not a reporter, but I was the inquisitor asking him things. And that's where I just really drew my respect for his intellect. He was already up in his age at that time. I haven't seen him for about 10 years now, but I suspect he was sharp to the end. But what a life story, Sean. And he loved the United States. He loved the United States because he recognized what opportunity was.
Recently he was in a wheelchair, and it seemed like he had just given a speech And this is going back maybe a month and a half ago, and some liberal reporter was asking him contentious questions, and like the pro he was, he just ignored it and got in the car and drove off. But you're right, what a life he lived. You know, sometimes maybe we get a little locked into where we are now in this moment and we lose historical perspective, you know, but he lived through the Vietnam era. That means the 60s. We know a lot of horrible things happened in this country, a great divide in this country. In the 60s, look at all the people assassinated in the 60s. You think of you know, the hippie movement. You think of the early 70s, the Nixon years, Vietnam. This was a divided country back then, too, Ari.
No question about it. 1968, in many ways, was the worst year we've had, worse than 2020 with the George Floyd riots and the COVID and everything else that took place. 68, at the height of Nixon and Vietnam, et cetera. And, you know, Henry Kissinger was the wise man who got the United States through so much of that. As you said, when he opened up relations with China, something that was absolutely unheard of, impossible to do, he did it. And it's a different China back then than it is now. But there were just certain things that were impossible in foreign policy, and I don't think Henry Kissinger ever accepted the word impossible. His life was a possibility. Coming to America was a possibility. He saw what the United States represented and relished it. And that's why I think the word impossible was never in Henry Kissinger's vocabulary, because of the life he led, but also the mind, Sean, and this is what I got to know about him. The mind that he had didn't see limits. He just saw opportunities in places and in ways other people did not see. They may have seen a dead end or a roadblock. He said, I'll get over that.
Yeah, China, Vietnam. He played such an important role historically at a very divided time in this country's history. Ari, we appreciate you staying with us. Thank you. Joining us now on the phone is Bret Baier, host of Special Report. Bret, let's get your initial reaction to this. What a towering figure he was. What an incredible life he led. 100 years old. And my last conversation with him, he was as sharp as ever.
Sean, he was as sharp as can be, even in the end. I mean, there were people who were clamoring to get to him to say, you know, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? He served as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State under President Richard Nixon, and then under Joe Ford. But, as you say, he was really a foreign policy guru for administrations, a lot of them. After that, I saw him last when he was at Charles Krauthammer's lunch. I came there. Charles asked me to a lunch, and I got there, and there was Kissinger. And we spent the entire lunch talking about everything around the world. He was an amazing person who understood foreign policy from a lot of different spectrums, a lot of different perspectives. And like Charles Krauthammer, he could cut through the noise, you know?
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. We use the term frequently called shuttle diplomacy. Well, he conducted the first shuttle diplomacy in his quest for Middle East peace. He used secret channels to pursue the ties between the U.S. and China, at that point ending what was decades of isolation and nothing but hostility between the two countries. He initiated the Paris negotiations that ultimately provided the means for an interval, as he called it, to get the U.S. out of Vietnam. It was 2 years later that Saigon fell to the communists. He was the one that pursued the policy of détente with the former Soviet Union, leading to arms control agreements and raised the possibilities that the tensions of the Cold War and its nuclear threat did not have to last forever. At 99, he was still out on a book tour on leadership. I mean, some of the most sensitive foreign policy negotiations he was a part of, and frankly, a trailblazer in this.
And he had that ability to talk in his deep voice that was a baritone voice that cut through the noise, and he would. There were people who were looking for his advice up until 99, up until 100, and it was truly amazing to see that he was that strong in foreign policy all these years. And, you know, I talked to him probably a few months ago, and he still had it.
You know, but Brett, I'll tell you one funny story. You know that I try to do these imitations. I don't think they're that great, but I one time did my imitation of him to him. I talk about bottom policy, you know, nice. And I said that to him, and he laughed. He had a great sense of humor on top of everything else.
He did. And if you could do Henry Kissinger, if you could do, you know, I can't do it, Sean.
Well, it would be, we talk about bottom policy. You know, that's the way he did it. And he'd come on Hannity and Combs with Alan and myself, and back in the day, too. He was just a giant of a man, heart of gold, brilliant mind to the very end. Brett, we really appreciate you taking time. Thanks for being with us tonight.
You bet.
All right. Sad news, one of America's legendary diplomats, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, died at the age of 100. While Kissinger has passed away, his legacy, that will live on forever. Let's take a look back.
With his towering intellect and ruthless realpolitik, his dazzling shuttle diplomacy and obsession with his own image, Henry Kissinger was perhaps the most gifted, admired, and reviled American diplomat of the 20th century.
There is no country in the world where it is conceivable that a man of my origins could be standing here next to the President of the United States.
A refugee from Hitler's Germany, Kissinger emigrated to the United States in 1938. After serving in Army counterintelligence in World War II, he earned 3 Harvard degrees. Kissinger's seminal 1957 book on nuclear strategy earned him consultancies to the Kennedy and Johnson White Houses.
Dr. Kissinger is a man who is known to all people who are interested in foreign policy.
As President Nixon's first-term national security advisor, Kissinger negotiated to end the Vietnam War, while the commander-in-chief withdrew U.S. troops and secretly bombed Cambodia. Another 20,000 U.S. troops and countless Vietnamese perished in the 4 years before Kissinger famously declared peace is at hand and received the Nobel Peace Prize. When the Cambodia bombings leaked to the press, Kissinger colluded in White House wiretaps.
Yes, to get to revitalize our alliances, get into a new relationship with the Soviets, to begin to feel our way towards the Chinese.
For Nixon's historic trip to China in 1972, it was Kissinger's secret overseas flights that paved the way, and their pursuit of détente with the Soviet Union led to major arms control accords, astonishing breakthroughs that earned Kissinger broad acclaim, but enduring suspicion among conservatives, who later argued he and Nixon should have sought, like Ronald Reagan, to defeat the Soviet Union.
In the early 1970s, I don't remember any conservative even talking about defeating the Soviet Union before one could even consider some of the aspects of Reagan's policy. Vietnam had to be finished. You can make as good a case for the fact that communism was ultimately defeated by the policies that Nixon started than by the policies that Reagan enunciated, and that Reagan could never have done what he did if Nixon had not first held the fort, created the structure.
Throughout his service to Nixon, Kissinger publicly heaped praise on the president in public.
There's a certain heroic quality about how he conducts his business.
But ridiculing him in private and ultimately taking a more measured view of his partner in power.
He lacked the capacity to reach out to people as individuals the way almost all the candidates that I've known did so naturally.
I shall testify with respect to all matters.
Confirmed as Secretary of State in 1973, Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy helped end the Yom Kippur War. After Nixon resigned, Kissinger stayed on, a reassuring figure amid the upheaval of Watergate, and also, for a time, an improbable celebrity bachelor. Hollywood actresses drawn to the famous diplomat who called power the ultimate aphrodisiac. Yet lawsuits and controversy would dog Kissinger for decades after he left power in 1977. Liberals called him a war criminal, claiming he had coddled right-wing dictators and was culpable in the assassination of 2 Chilean officials, charges Kissinger denied. Unfazed, the elder statesman trotted the globe, a wealthy consultant, his counsel widely sought. He could be critical of U.S. policy.
We have to stop lecturing the Russians on our concept of reform. I think what is lacking is a clear definition of what the purpose of our China policy is.
But Kissinger supported President Bush's muscular response to 9/11 and the Iraq War.
We are going to sit there and let weapons of mass destruction pile up in a country that has already used them against its neighbors and its own people, against which we fought a war 10 years ago.
In 2014, he gathered with 5 other secretaries of state for the groundbreaking of the United States Diplomacy Center. And to the last, he remained active in foreign policy discourse, writing a book called World Order, reviewed favorably in the Washington Post by Hillary Clinton, who, like all of Kissinger's successors, drew on his counsel when she served as America's Secretary of State.
Arrest Henry Kissinger for war crimes! Arrest Henry Kissinger for war crimes!
Agitators continued hounding Kissinger, as at this Senate Armed Services Committee hearing in early 2015, prompting Senator John McCain, a Vietnam veteran, to defend the one-time architect of U.S. policy there.
Get out of here, you low-life scum. I'd like to apologize for allowing such disgraceful behavior towards a man who served his country with the greatest distinction.
Lifelong student of balance of power politics, acclaimed author of more than a dozen books and embattled subject of dozens more, Henry Kissinger engaged every major foreign policy crisis across 6 decades of service and commentary, and strode the world stage with an authority and charisma matched by few other unelected figures in American history. In Washington, Rich Edson, Fox News.
All right, joining us now on the phone, someone who knew Dr. Kissinger very well. Our friend Monica Crowley is with us. Monica, thank you for being with us. A lot of people may not know about your background, but post-presidency, you worked for a long time very closely with Richard Nixon, and you were also very close to Henry Kissinger. Tell us about the man you knew and the man that Richard Nixon spoke of.
Yes, thank you, Sean. First of all, my deepest sympathies to Mrs. Kissinger and the rest of the Kissinger family. He lived such a long and substantial life, and it's never easy to lose someone, and I considered Henry Kissinger a friend, so I am very saddened by this news. Yeah, you know, Sean, my very first job out of college was with the former president, Richard Nixon. And during that period of time, I got to know a whole array of heads of state around the world and other diplomats and statesmen. And the one, of course, that stood out apart from President Nixon was Dr. Kissinger. And, Sean, I will tell you, the very first time I spoke to him, I was, you know, early 20s. And fresh out of college, and I remember sitting with President Nixon in his study, in his office, and the phone rang, and it was Dr. Kissinger, and over the intercom, Nixon's assistant said, "I have Dr. Kissinger on the phone for you," and so I went to get up to give him some privacy to take the call, and he waved me back down into my chair. Sean, he said, "Sit," and he picked up the phone, and he said, "Henry." And the two of them spoke for a couple of minutes, and they often spoke a couple of times a week about the state of the world and what American foreign policy was and what it should be. And at one point in the conversation, Sean, he said, "Henry, I want you to speak to my new foreign policy assistant, Monica Crowley. Say hello to her." And then he thrust the phone receiver toward me, and I'm 21, 22 years old. He thrust it toward me, and I ended up talking to Henry Kissinger in front of Richard Nixon, and it was a complete out-of-body experience. These two men working together in the White House and then beyond, two towering intellects, Sean, who work together to advance America's interests in the world. What a tremendous partnership.
Well, I can't say it any better. Well said. What a life experience for you too, Monica. Our thoughts and prayers go out to his family tonight. Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.